And welcome to this Yara technical webinar presented in association with CPM. My name is Allen-Stevens, I'm editor of CPM, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on achieving net zero by 2040, how the industry is helping growers. And it's a topic that's really captured the attention of farmers, particularly those in the arable sector, over the past 12 months. And I think it's fair to say that the arable sector was lagging behind in engaging with this issue. Horticulture, dairy, even beef and lamb have been brought into it through their supplier or consumer demand. The cereal and oilseed sector is, of course, somewhat removed from the consumer, but nevertheless, the obligations to meet net zero are just as critical for arable farmers. And there are considerable opportunities, too, to sequester carbon and be part of the solution to climate change. In fact, I might even suggest it's the realization of this that has brought in so many arable farmers, never shy of sniffing out a potential opportunity, you might say, who are now keen to find out what these are. So that's what this webinar is about. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so discussing net zero, and particularly where fertilizer use sits within that. It accounts for the lion's share of emissions on the average arable farm, but there's plenty we can do to reduce and mitigate this, as we'll find out today. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to point out to everyone to the February issue of CPM. And page 44, there was an article that I was really pleased to be to put together with Yara's help on this subject, and it explores the arable carbon balance in some detail. So don't pick it up now, but when this webinar is finished, do pick up your CPM, have a look, and read all about it. So just a few housekeeping points. Our two presenters will speak for about 10 minutes each, and we'll go straight from one to the other before moving on to questions. So I'm delighted to introduce Mark Tucker from Yara and Matt Culley, who's an arable farmer north of Andover in Hampshire. Matt is current chairman of the NFU Combinable Crops. Net zero has been a key policy objective for the NFU ever since Minette Batters announced it at the Oxford Farming Conference in, I think it was 2019. I know that Matt is a keen enthusiast for how the arable sector can contribute and has put a lot of work in personally to help us on our journey to net zero. So Matt, can I ask you to tell us more, please?
Thank you, Tom, and thanks everyone for listening in. So, bring on my first slide. Okay, so the NFU has set an ambitious aspiration of reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions across agriculture in England and Wales by 2040. Agriculture is in a unique place to be part of the solution to UK government's ambition of net zero by 2050. Our land-based economy, as shown in this slide, is well placed to capture CO2 and turn it into foods, fibres and fuels. By increasing and enhancing our land's ability to capture carbon, we can use it to generate negative emissions. So in facilitating and helping farmers to deliver the net zero aspiration, the NFU developed three key pillars to act upon. So pillar one, boosting productivity and reducing emissions, developing a variety of measures to address farming's productivity whilst using inputs in smarter ways, producing the same quantities or more with less. In turn, this will enable the sector to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Examples of this, so the use of controlled release fertilizers and inhibitors to boost the nitrogen use efficiencies of our crops. Precision farming techniques to deliver nutrients and crop protection more efficiently. Increasing soil organic matters, increase carbon storage, and increase the nutrient holding capacity of our soils. Pillar two, farmland carbon storage. So again, enhancing soil carbon storage with less tillage, for instance, or cover cropping where appropriate. Enhancing and increasing hedgerows, promoting options within elms, for instance, and increasing woodland plantings on lower yielding sites, which is supported by government ambition. And our pillar three is coupling bioenergy to carbon capture, utilization and storage. So this is boosting renewable energy and the bioeconomy to displace greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel and to create carbon capture through photosynthesis. So this slide is involving our government engagement. So in the early autumn of 2020, the NFU, along with other stakeholder organisations, landed the ELMS white paper at government's doorstep, titled Our Vision for Sustainable Food and Farming Scheme. This scheme will be a key contributor to industry's ambition to net zero by 2040. It is rightly recognised that the FFS will be well placed to drive net zero, and is no coincidence that many of the measures across all five themes within the white paper are highly compatible with low carbon farming, particularly those measures contributing to the pillars 1 and 2 that I mentioned earlier, so enhanced productivity and carbon storage. We've also had engagement with net zero testing trials. So DEFRA has approved the NFU's proposal for a new ELMS testing trials, specifically focused on net zero. The project has been fully designed by the NFU and is to be tested on 200 farms across the country throughout this year into the autumn of 2021. So the objectives include activities with ELMS needed for productivity measures, land management plans that are farmer-centric and drive towards net zero practices, and also levels of advice and guidance to help farmers deliver the public goods achieving net zero via options facilitated in workshops and one-to-one guidance. So one of our key asks is a stronger domestic bioenergy supply chain to support Pillar 3 ambitions. The government has published its response to the 2020 climate change report, and within this it has recognised some key NFU asks: a recognition of the bioenergy sector in terms of net zero. Government has committed to developing a new bioenergy strategy by 2022, including key role acceptance for biomass and bioenergy. Also within the 2020 climate change report, government makes numerous references to ELMS and the Environment Bill and the roles that they can play in achieving net zero targets. Also, some key engagement is our local authorities engagement. So the NFU has recently published an interactive booklet for local authorities, identifying ways in which LAs can work with farmers towards net zero agriculture. Based on our 3 pillars again, the booklet sets out opportunities for a low carbon local economy, how funding can be delivered in a balanced way across communities, supporting examples such as sourcing food locally, broadband speed improvements, renewable energy networks, and planning issues and policy. So the next slide just focuses on our member engagement. So the NFU has developed a net zero pledge map, which is an online facility where members can follow a simple tick box questionnaire, which is then placed onto our map as a pledge. We've also developed our farm status indicator. This has evolved from the pledge map, and this online tool sets out questions where members can easily input what they do on farm in terms of net zero, and gives a general score from 1 to 5 as an indication of where an individual farmer and his business sits on his net zero journey. We've also used the nitrogen use efficiency project and survey. So the NUE project has been run by the NFU since autumn 2019 as part of the Agricultural Productivity Task Force. In conjunction with DEFRA, it seeks to progress the issue of productivity and how the arable sector may gather farmer-centric data on nitrogen use efficiency in wheat. Whilst yield has traditionally been a proxy for productivity in our sector, such farmer-centric data can be used to create key performance indicators, which opens up opportunities for the industry and businesses to measure progress, compare and set targets in regards to reaching net zero. So the survey that was launched in November of last year and runs to the end of this month ask questions regarding members' 2019 harvest. It includes questions such as yield, soil types, rates and application methods of artificial nitrogen, alongside use of organic materials. Having completed the survey, members receive a score for their nitrogen use efficiency outputs for the parcel of land that they have reported on. It is intended that this survey will run on a yearly basis. And also the Net Zero Live event in November 2020. That was really good member engagement, and this is planning to be run next year. Excuse me, let's bring up my next slide. So this is just about my net zero journey on my farm. So I've done the farm's NFU Farm Status Indicator and Pledge Map, also ADAS Carbon Workshop. I'm looking to carry on addressing nitrogen use efficiency on my farm. So I installed liquid fertilizer and sprayer technology for my application. Looking to maintain margins on lower yielding soils via growing crops with less inputs, but maybe with better premiums to maintain my margins. Also, we are integrating livestock into the rotation. We're doing this with a neighbouring dairy farm that wishes to expand, and so we're grassing down areas of soils that need a break from our rotation, and hope to build up the carbon storage of those soils by adding livestock. Also, we're looking at the integration of forage crops for livestock and AD, and in return for the AD forage that we grow, we are returning the digestate and adding that back to our soils as organic matter. Also, I have aims to start measuring hedgerows, looking at woodland and permanent pasture for carbon sequestration, and ultimately I want to achieve one of the carbon calculators that are available to really drive down into where I am. So priorities going forward. So for the NFU, well, we've thrown our support behind COP26, so the UN Climate Challenge Conference in November, and so that's a key part of our campaign. Also, we look to drive down into sequestration and fairness of carbon counting for the arable sector, and we're also looking to seek out opportunities for the crop sector, so things like specific end markets and carbon markets. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. That was a really good insight into what the NFU is doing, and there does seem to be a lot going on, a lot that members can get involved with, which is fantastic. Anyway, moving straight on, we've had one or two questions, but we're going to move straight on to our other speaker. Most of you, I'm sure, will know Mark Tucker, who is Agronomy and Business Development Manager for Yara for the UK and Ireland. Now, I always love doing articles with Mark because his technical knowledge of the subject is pretty much unrivaled. And I always learn something new when I speak with him, and have done for probably the best part of 20 years now. So, Mark, I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Great, thank you, Tom. Where are those 20 years gone? My goodness. Yeah, delighted to be on this evening, and thank you for all listening, taking up your time this evening. So moving straight on, really, as it's been highlighted there in a number of Matt's fertiliser, and whenever we get involved in discussions of carbon footprints, etc., then fertiliser invariably crops up fairly quickly. So over the next few minutes, just try and give you a little bit of insight into some subjects there, from just where does carbon footprint of fertiliser fit in terms of the whole scheme of things, where those hot spots are, and production and use coming in there, and then low-hanging fruits, which can be something to go away with and think about, and then just a little bit of insight into some of the medium-long-term opportunities that lie ahead. So that's the aim of the next few minutes. Firstly, I guess the two areas which start to really impact on fertiliser and its carbon footprint is, on the one hand, how can industry, and how particularly obviously fertiliser, how can it decarbonise itself from the selection and production process, from the raw materials, from the energy that goes into that production, through to the logistics, to the farmer, and then as we move through to the end consumer, then we can bring in the other element of some decarbonisation and reducing carbon footprints and more sustainability through the circular economy. And that's another area that Yara are heavily investing in terms of how we can turn waste, which inevitably has nutrition and nutrients in it, that probably originated in a fertiliser factory somewhere, ends up on a farm, ends up in a rubbish bin somewhere, and we have the opportunity to recycle that waste and bring it back in as nutrients for use on the farm. And that's really the circular economy piece that can also be a part of sustainability and improving carbon footprints. So the main bit to me for this evening really is to touch on that decarbonisation bit in terms of production and use. And yeah, in the months and years ahead, we can pick up very much the circular economy piece as well. So in terms of just initially then, the carbon footprint of produce is highlighted there in the dairy sector. Then you can immediately see when you start to look at a life cycle analysis of milk, that fertiliser production crops up in terms of the carbon footprint, but then also the big chunk that's highlighted in the middle there, the field emissions associated with the applications of nitrogen that happen. So that's the dairy side, but also if we take the long-term experiments from Rothamsted, that well-renowned institute to all of us, then we can put some numbers on those. And again, what we see is that whether it's the amber orangey colour here, we can see that's the production of fertiliser and how its contribution is made to the carbon footprint, but also the slightly dirty, murky green colour. I suspect how it's come for you at the top of that bar chart. That's the other hotspot where we've got N2O emissions which are related to the field. So again, always these hotspots that we can pick out. And that's important because we can then start to think how we manage them. Now, in terms of that N2O emission from production, then that was the sort of, I guess, the first bit that the industry looked to try and resolve. And if we think about that, where is that bit in terms of the production? Where is that hotspot? Then you've got hydrogen coming from the traditional fertiliser production system, having hydrogen coming from a fossil fuel, whether it's natural gas or coal, as the feedstock, to produce ammonia, which then goes into nitric acid production to produce ammonium nitrate, NPKs, etc. So within that production, within that nitric acid bit is where we lose the N2O during that process. So that was the bit that needed addressing, and it was some years ago now, decades ago actually, when Yara started to really investigate what could be done here to clean up that process. And it came through with its catalyst technology, which it had then installed in all of its factories by 2009. And then it did indeed commercialise that to other fertiliser manufacturers to be able to utilise that technology to abate their plants. So that's the name, I should say, the word to look for. That abatement technology is what came into the nitric acid plants, which then reduced and converted the N2O that was escaping back into inert nitrogen and oxygen that effectively is the starting point. So that had a real dramatic impact on the carbon footprint. And as we see in the next slide, then suddenly that portion that we saw as a big, large a large orange amber colour on your screen shrinks down to a much smaller one, leaving the carbon footprint then as it is on the right of the screen, so much reduced. What it highlights though is then the importance of how we move to understanding N2O emissions in the field, because as you can see there, we've still got that as a problem and a challenge to address. And I would say that nitrogen escaping from the field shouldn't just be sort of segmented out as a fertiliser, purely a fertiliser issue. If we have reactive nitrogen in our soils, then by definition they have the potential to escape, whether it's leaching or N2O emissions or whatever. So we just need to always think about that in a more rounded view in terms of as fertility builds, then we run the risk of losses there. So that leaves us that bit that we need to then address. The other component to the carbon footprint of fertilizers, which needs thinking about and is highlighted if we do sort of life cycle analysis, is that the country of origin that when that fertilizer is produced means that you end up with this different carbon footprint in terms of what the feedstock is and the energy efficiency effectively of the plants that are producing that product and that input to the farm. And you can see there on the screen whether it's the ammonium nitrate on the left from a European factory where it's got a baited technology being used, and it's down at the 3.32. But as we move to whether it's Russian, North American, Chinese being the worst there in terms of the coal-based production facilities that they would have, you've got a threefold increase in terms of the carbon footprint associated with that fertilizer. Likewise, if we look at urea on the right, then again we see differences in terms of whether it's from a European factory at 3.5 through to the coal-based production. Again, double or so there in terms of the CO2 per kilogram of N. This is what's being described there. Now you'll note on the right, then urea has to have an element of CO2 lost in the field, because just look at the chemical equation of urea versus ammonium nitrate. One has carbon in, the other doesn't. So that CO2, that carbon comes out immediately as CO2, and that needs to be accounted for in the carbon footprint. So you can see there the two numbers added together is the number above the chart. So country of origin being another important bit in the decision-making process. So I think as we move forward then, when you are purchasing, and if we are to really meet our sustainability goals and ambitions towards net zero, then a couple of things there. Firstly, to be thinking about and asking for, it's that abated nitrogen fertilizer, so that you're you know that the N2O has been dealt with at the production facility, and then of course the region of origin there, which we need to think about. Moving on to the next bit, I guess, a more longer term that we need to think about then is how can we decarbonise further? And in that sense, we've got green nitrates as the potential. Why green nitrates? Well, that's really because we're now doing green ammonia as the production facility or at the production site. So in this scenario, then you can see on the screen there that we had carbon footprints related to the fossil fuel that was used as a feedstock, whereas now we're moving to using electrolysis, which is then powered by renewable energy. So that's where we then have a dramatic impact. Now it does come at a cost that we can't get around that. Sustainability for all of us, I think, will come at a cost in terms of the price we pay for goods and services. So that's there. But what we end up with is green ammonia, and that green ammonia can then go through nitric acid process to produce our nitrates. You note that the urea has gone from the slide there because the CO2 that's produced during production can be normally, under normal circumstances, can be utilised for production of urea. Well, obviously, if you're not using a fossil fuel as the feedstock, then you're not ending up with carbon dioxide. Therefore, you're not ending up with that CO2 to produce your urea. So yeah, green nitrates is that next step in decarbonising. The time that it's going to take, I think, is likely to be the next 10 years. And I'm hoping you can all still hear me. Kind of a bit of a glitch there. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yep, we can hear you, Mark.
Yes, we can hear you.
Everything going good. My apologies. So yeah, so we end up with the green nitrates. The timescale we're looking at here is we would hope to have some first pilot production coming through maybe 2024, that sort of period. But certainly as we head towards 2028, then you can be expecting to see these sort of products coming through, so therefore can really contribute towards a lot of the net zero sort of ambitions that are there. So that's a more longer term, and you'll see lots of activity out there with investors seeing the green ammonia as a way forward, and whether it's hydroelectric power projects in Scandinavia and Norway, and whether it's solar power green ammonia being produced in Australia, or most recently then the tie-up with wind power for our plant over in Sluiskil, which is using wind power as that green ammonia project. So lots of investment going on in it. And indeed, really hot off the press has been the announcement last week on the 9th of February where Yara set up and established its new business unit called Yara Clean Ammonia. So that again signals the intention that Yara have in terms of its investment into this sort of technology and really take a key sort of active role in sustainability as we go forward. So again, look out for those projects that are going to continue to develop and progress. The next bit, I guess, is to sort of head back to that dirty green sort of box that we highlighted earlier on, where we've got this N2O emission out in the field, and really we can start to think about what drives that N2O emission, and that's something that can be very much a part of research going forward. The amount we use has a part to play there in terms of how much fertilizer we put on, and particularly perhaps at any one time, and then how we can, and the soil conditions that goes on. So I think there are a few things that we really need to think about when it comes to the rate that we apply to really achieve our nitrogen use efficiency. And I've highlighted it there, and Matt made lots of references there to it, and there's some great work being done by the NFU to benchmark that. And we ought to be having targets as farmers and advisors of around that 80%. That's what the European Nitrogen Group has established as a sort of good target figure we should have. As we look to try and achieve that sort of thing, then we need to be very cautious about using yield as our driver for calculating nitrogen rates, because sometimes that yield can be, that last ton or two can be driven by conditions that through June and July when we've done our fertilizer applications, and it can lead us to over application if we're not careful. So be very cautious about using yield as a driver for that. What we'd rather be looking at is the conditions in the field, in the season, be very site specific with the technology that's there in terms of precision tools, whether it's the at-farm satellite-based systems or the tractor-mounted end sensor, end tester BT that you'll see all out there. Lots of tools and technology being really promoted to help maximise and improve nitrogen management. So really look towards that. And again, I would say just really think about those soil conditions, and the last two autumns, winters have really shown us some of the challenges. But what we do want to be doing is really managing that number one asset that you have towards a well-structured soil that doesn't, or waterlogs as least as possible. So going from a poorly structured to a well-structured soil and using all the techniques and technologies and opportunities there are to improve soil structure is one area I really advocate, because we know that N2O emissions on poor soils is that much higher than well-structured soils. So a good consideration there to help towards improving emissions. So finally, just to summarise, as we come to the end here, then I guess, four key messages to take away there. Really do think about and ask for abated nitrogen when it comes to that choice. Think about the country of origin, those European factories, very, very efficient, using all the latest technology to minimise emissions. In the next decade, you can start to be looking out for green ammonia products that will come forward and again further help towards achieving sustainability. And then finally there, right the way through the growing season, look to do everything you can to firstly measure and benchmark your nitrogen use efficiency, and then start to have targets in place. Use technology so that we do end up, and Matt made reference to it as well, that we end up with more from less as an end result. So yeah, hopefully that's taken you through given some insight, as I said, into some areas there, and I'll go back to Tom as we head towards Q&A.
Great, thank you very much for that, Mark. No, that was a really fascinating insight, and I have to say the stuff on the green ammonia in particular is really exciting, and look forward to seeing those developments come through. So we'll move straight into the questions. We've had a few come through, and I'll try and read some in as we go through. But if you've submitted a question and we don't have time for it, then what we'll try to do is answer to you after the webinar. Now, I feel like here a quick question, or is going back to what you were talking about, Matt, and the involvement of the NFU in the ELMS testing trials. You said that there were 200 farmers involved in that. Have you got your 200 farmers, or are you looking for 200 farmers to get involved in that?
I believe we already have the testing trials, the 200 farmers set up. So I don't believe that we are looking for any more at the moment.
Okay.
But that's not to say
we've had questions that have been pre-submitted. Thank you very much for all of your questions. One topic that has been really popular is the question of carbon calculators. And thank you very much to Nick Bush, to Richard Foster, to Nigel Hester, to Graham Manson, who have all submitted questions on this topic. I'm going to take a question from Tim Beaver, who's asked a question on carbon calculators. There seem to be so many carbon calculators out there, so where do you go for a good one? And also he's asked, how will imported goods be treated which have no carbon footprint? So Matt, could I ask you to have a go at that one, please?
Yeah, so for the carbon calculators, so the NFU has done a carbon calculator review, and so it looked at 3 carbon calculators: Cool Farm carbon calculator, the Farm carbon calculator, and AgriCalc. So we applied some quite strict, not conditions, but a wish list for the carbon calculators. None of the 3 carbon calculators reviewed covered all of our needs, although it's important to realise that the different scales in which the tools operate. For instance, Cool Farm carbon calculator can focus on one product, such as wheat, whereas the Farm Carbon and AgriCalc consider the whole farm carbon footprint. So, I mean, if you're an NFU member, then you can go online and have a look at that review. It does give you some really good information on a starting place, but also a good starting place for, is the NFU pledge map and the carbon status indicator, as they are more simple for the start of your journey. When it comes down to the inputs, I mean, that is something that's going to have to play out, I think, the import, sorry, when it comes to the carbon, looking at carbon imports. I mean, if we start to look at carbon taxes, for instance, on our inputs, then we're going to have to really push that imports are looked at as well, and potentially we could push government to look at tariffs on imports, sorry, that don't have the carbon footprint that we do, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, very good point. One point that's come through from Nigel Hester, without a single accurate and consistent assessment method, how will the UK agriculture know that it's actually achieved net zero? Have you got any thoughts on this, Matt?
I think the next goal really is to find the carbon calculator that can be used as the benchmark across sectors, and one that fits for everyone's needs, and that is going to be a key goal. And until we find that, then we can't really find that total farm carbon footprint and what we're doing on farm. So yeah, I agree, we need to find that single carbon calculator that the industry can use as the benchmark. But
yeah, and you mentioned just in your answer there about a possible carbon tax. We've got a question here from Gary Bradbury. Thank you, Gary, for this question. The Prime Minister has recently asked his ministers to draw up proposals for a possible new range of carbon taxes. What do you think will happen? Do you think we'll have an actual measurement? Again, he's asked on which to base our own carbon emissions, and what about imports?
So, yeah, farmers could gain from access to a robust reward price, carbon reward price for greenhouse gas removals, but we could also be put at a competitive disadvantage by a carbon tax on our inputs. So it's key that, you know, that the organisations such as the NFU really push government very hard on when they look at potential taxes on inputs. I'm sure the government won't want to tax a consumer because it's not politically in their interest to do so. So the concern is that there could be a carbon tax on inputs. So at that point, we will really press, if that comes, on imports, again, as I mentioned earlier, and possible tariffs on imports when it comes down to carbon. But it's important to recognise that I think we've been here before in terms of the threat of the pesticide tax, and that the VI was brought in to stop that tax, and it did a very good job of doing so, because it got the growers who are using the chemicals, using the pesticides, to come together and show what we're doing in a responsible way. And I think we may need that again with the VI when it comes down to our fertilizer applications, particularly our nitrogen applications, to show what we are doing and doing it in the correct way. And that would be one way of staving off a carbon tax on our inputs, hopefully.
Great. Mark, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on this, you know, on the question of carbon calculators and also a carbon tax.
Yeah, absolutely with Matt on that, in terms of wanting a calculator which we can all get behind, if you like, so that we can benchmark and compare and contrast and see how progress is being made, rather than progress being just from change of calculator. So I think really, yeah, definitely very much agree there. The taxation, yeah, hearing about that, not just UK, but across governments in Europe as well, in terms of how thinking about how they can change behaviour, if you like. And I guess all I would say is a lot of those sort of comments are made because there's a level of urgency that is now coming into the discussion around climate change, sustainability, etc. So I think, and if you want quick fixes to something, sometimes taxation is seen as part of that. What I think it's incumbent for all of us to do in the industry, therefore, is to take on board the technologies that are out there and really then show the progress that's being made through the use of that technology, through the use of calculators, so that there's a real attention being paid to it. And I think if government picks up those sorts of messages and that they see the industry is taking very much control of it and really making a contribution, then I think that would clearly help in terms of that discussion. So yeah, urge that adoption of all of the technologies that are being talked about.
Great, no, thanks for that, Mark. Staying with you, Mark, we've got a question here from Valerie Stanton about, do you anticipate that future nitrogen purchases will come with their own carbon footprint, depending on how or where they've been produced, and that we'll have to account for that in calculating our own footprint?
Yeah, certainly that there are quite a few details on websites, but they're often not very easily found. And certainly it is something, and just speaking from our own point of view, then it's very much a project where we're looking to have that sort of detail very clearly available for farmers as we go through this year, so that anyone using a particular grade from a particular factory can start to have more accurate calculations that they can make for it. So yeah, very much looking to improve that accessibility of that sort of data. Hello.
Have we lost Tom? Mark, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Eva. Yes. Yeah.
I think, have we lost Tom? Not to worry. We'll keep going with the questions.
No, apologies. I did the classic thing of putting myself on mute and forgetting to unmute myself. Apologies for that. So sorry, Mark. Coming
Welcome
back to
you. You saved me.
Yeah, we've had a quick question. Sorry, Mark. Just staying with you. We've had a quick question through from Tim Walters, who's he's asking about the main manufacturers responsible for ammonium nitrate production. Have they all switched over to abated nitrogen? Is it just a European thing? Is it a geographical thing, or is it by manufacturer? How do you know whether it's abated nitrogen?
I think to be absolutely certain, you need to pose that question when you're purchasing. The main, whether it's main factories in Western Europe, I would say would have adopted that technology and invested in that, but it's not for certain that all of them have. So I think the only way really to find that out is by asking that question at the point of purchase, and then you would get an answer, a yay or a nay on that. The main manufacturers supplying into the UK, Yara, CF, then would be at the level of that abated technology. The other ones just needs to be questioned in terms if they're further Eastern European, then not all of those will be. So just needs to be clarified at the point of purchase, I think.
Great. Now, another area of questions that we've had quite a lot of questions on is on, I guess you call it total plant carbon. Thank you very much to Laura Buckingham and to Andrew Rigg for asking these questions. I'll go to Andrew's question, which was, I'd like to know your views on how carbon leaving the farm in the form of, say, wheat is accounted for when assessing a farm's carbon balance or carbon credentials. Mark, would you like to address that first?
Yes, and yes, it is a bit of an issue there in terms of, I guess, how the calculations are done, and that ton of wheat or whatever will have a carbon footprint associated with it. The most important thing with any of that, if it's a full life cycle assessment that's done, then it just depends what's happened to that carbon, that ton of wheat when it leaves the farm. If it were to go in to displace a fossil fuel energy somehow, then potentially there's some sort of carbon that could be accounted for there. It just depends the scope of the calculation, because again, if a yield per hectare were to prevent grassland being ploughed up or woodland being taken down somewhere else in the world, then of course there's a value to be had with that. So that's why again we would urge for really full life cycle assessment, so that you don't end up with just exporting a pollution event. So yeah, the carbon associated with that ton of wheat will very much depend on its destination. If it's just a transitional going back into the food chain, if you like, then it's that carbon comes out again. But if it could be shown that it displaces fossil fuel somewhere else, then of course there could be a value attached to that.
Oh, great, thanks. I don't know whether Matt, whether you've got any views on this. I mean, it seems to me that it's a bit unfair on farmers that, you know, we capture all this carbon into our wheat. It's not our decision to release it again. It happens at the consumer's door. You know, when it leaves the farm, it's still all captured. Surely we should get the credit for that. What are your thoughts as far as this is concerned?
Well, I mean, it is correct to say at the moment that the carbon just moves with the product throughout the supply chain, and from the work that I've seen, the carbon cycle in our wheat, yes, we do sequester carbon, but we do release it as far as the rules state at the moment, and when the wheat is harvested, and it moves on to the next part of the supply chain. So that is counted in our carbon countings. What's really important, I think, is to realise that we have to show ways of and find ways of not releasing the carbon that's in our soil to help us with our carbon counting. And so that does lend itself more to reduced tillage or direct drilling or cover cropping and a regenerative agriculture. in terms of you know, counting the carbon that we save in our soil and keeping the carbon in our soil. That's not to say that we can't push for more recognition with our and how our crops sequester carbon. I think it's always important that we keep those conversations going, keep pushing for that. But currently, at the moment, I think it's the IPCC rules just, you know, state that carbon moves with the product as it's taken off. So that's where we sit. But you know, we will keep pushing on those questions.
Great. Just staying with carbon accounting for one last quick question from Clive Backer. Thank you very much, Clive, for this one. Do farmers have to be negative in emissions before they can sell carbon? Sorry, Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, currently there isn't a marketplace for carbon at the moment, not to any extent, anyhow. So yes, I think we'd have to be neutral at least, so net zero, not potentially per product of what for wheat, for example, but across our farms. So looking at ways in which you can use what's available on your farm to get to carbon neutral as soon as possible, then developing other ways to reduce on top of that would then help you with carbon credits and being able to trade carbon. So it's really important that we all look at how we can reduce our carbon footprint and get to net zero on our farms as soon as possible, because ultimately, you know, the hope is that we will be able to trade our carbon credits in the future.
Great. Well, moving on with another area that we've had a lot of questions on is on urea, and as you can imagine, with the recent urea consultation. So thank you very much to Laura Buckingham for this question. What will be the impact of the urea consultation on the use of urea, especially UAN? Also, what is the biological impact of N inhibitors versus ammonia losses? Which is worse? So, Mark, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, good question there. I guess the overall, first and foremost, ammonia isn't a greenhouse gas, so we shouldn't get that confused with any of the sort of mentions that we've had already. So ammonia is a separate topic. The consultation has just happened, and yes, I think we can anticipate, just like we have seen across Europe, that straight urea usage will be going down to try and mitigate that ammonia loss. That could see a switch across towards UAN and AN, of course, from the users of that. But that's still better. UAN, whilst it does emit ammonia, is still half the emissions of the urea. So whatever, if there is a move across to liquid UAN, then that is a plus for the ammonia calculation. This also brings in, of course, the whole story around inhibitors. As we see, there are much more talk about inhibitors in terms of their use. There certainly needs to be clarity in terms of what inhibitors are, in the sense of there's a whole mix of them out there, some ureas, some nitrification. So being absolutely clear for farmers to understand what the inhibitor is and what it's doing. And they do, of course, reduce ammonia loss, whether put with a liquid or a urea. I think what we feel that there's a need for, because of lack of data and lack of extensive use in these things, is that we need real clarity in terms of those inhibitors, what impact they could have on a biological system where farmers are tasked with improving soil health, using all sorts of biological thinking around how we can improve soils and soil fertility. And the last thing we would want to do is to have a negative impact with sudden extensive use of lots of inhibitors. So we just need to be, I think, wary of that. The best thing we can really focus on is, yes, using the products which have the lowest emissions, ammonia, and it's without doubt, it's not questioned there. Ammonium nitrate is the one that will give you the lowest ammonia emission. And then we focus on how best we can utilize that in with all the tools and services out there so that we can improve the efficiency. And that's going to be probably our single best way of trying to think about reducing ammonia.
That's great. Just sticking with nitrate use efficiency again. Well, we've had a question through from James Darlington, and this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Mark. A basic farming practice has been good soil structure and don't apply fertilizer to waterlogged soils. With NO2 emissions at this current high status from the field, it's hard to see how exactly this can be reduced without lowering nitrogen usage and lowering yields. So is there going to be a new product developed for less NO2 emissions?
Yeah, I mean, the N2O emission, if the worst case scenario is fertilizer going onto a waterlogged soil, which drives higher levels of N2O. So the first thing is to want to be applying it to a mineralizing soil when you'll reduce the chance of that and the risk of that. Now, there are inhibitors out there, which the nitrification inhibitors, which are very old chemistry and have been around for years, but there is some evidence that they themselves can have an impact on N2O. But again, those inhibitors, the very way they're working in the soil is to impact on the biology of the soil. So again, it's this making sure an unintended consequence of use of those might cause a negative impact somewhere else. So yeah, there will be a lot of research go into now N2O emissions of soils, I'm sure, and it needs to happen because as we see from production side of fertilizer, then the carbon footprint will be brought right down, which exposes the field emission. And that field emission can come from all forms of nutrient that go on in terms of nitrogen. It's not just something that's associated with fertilizer, whether it's a digestate, whether it's a manure, and anything with reactive nitrogen in it can have an impact on the N2O emission. So no doubt more research will go into that and how we can best reduce that. But the first thing is, don't rush out with very high rates onto a very waterlogged soil.
No, absolutely. I've just wanted to, one question that we've had through from Mervyn Parry. Thank you very much, Mervyn, for this. About how the different governments across the UK, because we've been talking quite a bit about the policy. I mean, obviously, fertilizer use is very much affected by policy. How would is there any difference in the rules concerning fertilizer use across the devolved countries in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and Northern Ireland? Matt, would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, so the UK government will set targets when it so base targets, things like net zero, and they'll set targets in that way. But I'm sure devolved parliaments will want to address these in their own ways, as they have the devolved powers on their agricultural policy. For instance, I think Wales has just, I think the Welsh Parliament are trying to introduce the whole of Wales into a nitrate vulnerable zone, where in England, for instance, we only have areas of nitrate vulnerable zones. So there will be differences, I'm sure, in how agricultural policy develops across the devolved areas of the UK, and also looking at potential. So, for instance, in Northern Ireland, it's they're looking at potential payments for homegrown proteins, and that can well sit under their net zero banner. So, whilst we can maybe use that the Northern Ireland option and push our own government, so DEFRA, for instance, on looking at that for English and Welsh proteins as well. So although we will see a devolution in policy, I think it's important that we can use those devolutions in the best way for our opportunities.
Great. No, thank you very much for that, Matt. Moving on, we've got a very interesting question from Natalia Gulbis, who's asking, there's evidence that N input could be reduced when plants are treated with plant growth promoting rhizobacteria that boost crop efficiency and nutrient uptake. How would you advise tailoring N input to account for their use? So, Mark, what do you think of these growth promoting rhizobacteria?
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of.
Mark, are you on mute?
I'm hoping can you hear me? Hello?
No, we can hear you. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, great question there, and lots of technologies coming through, such as that mentioned there. And I think what it ends up meaning is that you've got to be very aware of the crop itself in terms of, is it getting that supply of nitrogen from whatever technology, if it's a rhizobacteria, etc., that is being used. So it's very much then a case of monitoring and measuring the crop in terms of its nitrogen uptake to make sure it isn't deficient at all, and then possibly intervening with smaller applications, whether it's through foliar or through solid applications, where you can just keep it ticking over, because you've got to sort of balance that. If it is a rhizobium, you don't want to be upsetting it by feeding it too much nitrogen. But likewise, you don't want the crop to come under nitrogen deficiency. So I think in those sorts of scenarios, and whether it's building soil fertility through cover crops, green manures, digestates, all sorts of things that are happening, building organic matter, then what that does is mean that you're doing that to improve the underlying fertility of the soil. What you want to then do is understand the release of that soil nitrogen, and whether it's coming through to the crop at the right time and when's it coming through. So all of that lends itself then to really using the technology that's out there to measure and monitor the crop, whether it's from satellites, little end testers, sending crops off to labs, and really getting a good understanding of that nutrient uptake and whether the crop is now being met in terms of its demand.
No, that's fantastic. Well, sticking with you, if you don't mind, Mark, we've got quite a few questions on nitrogen use efficiency. I'm afraid we haven't got time to tackle them all, unfortunately. But there is one question here from Tim Kerr at Hutchinson. Thank you also to John Telfer and to Tom Clark, and also Mark Middleton, who's asked questions on nitrogen use efficiency. This one from Tim. Mark, according to the survey of fertilizer practice, there are still many farmers not applying sulfur. Surely this remains an easy way of improving nitrogen use efficiency.
Yeah, great question there from Tim, and for sure, anything that we can get a little extra yield, which without the use of any further nitrogen, clearly just by calculation and mathematics, that tells us that we're improving nitrogen uptake and offtake by way of yield. So anything we can do, and sulfur is exactly one of those, where you can be getting an extra anywhere from 0.4 of a tonne upwards of your, without doing anything further to your nitrogen applications, then is going to bring nitrogen use efficiency gains, just like it is with those other nutrients, micronutrients, etc., that are out there. By just driving a little bit extra yield without applying further nitrogen, then clearly brings efficiency gains. So yeah, absolutely, make sure that you are covering some of the bases, and sulfur is one of those. We know 90% of soils are deficient, so we should all be having it as part of our strategy.
Great, and I think we've got time for just one more question, and I'm very fond of this question. Actually, it's submitted by James Geneva. Thank you, James, for this one. Mark, it's you again, I'm afraid. Do you think that there will be farm-scale green ammonia production in the future? So farm-scale green ammonia production in the future, or do you think the process will only work in large-scale plants? A quick response, please.
Yeah, very good question. I think the answer is there will be examples of pilot. You know, we're already seeing pilot projects of, I wouldn't say necessarily green ammonia, but fertilizer produced at the farm scale with sort of mini units, generators, plasma technology, all sorts being used. So I think the answer is yes, and I suspect we'll end up with a balance of some very highly efficient green ammonia coming through for fertilizer use and production, but also where we can use some local waste materials that can be converted into fertilizer as well. So I'm sure it'll be a combination of all, but yeah, keep an eye out on the technology as it advances.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you very much for that, Mark, and thank you very much to you as well, Matt. That's really all we've got time for. Thank you both of you for your insight and your expertise. I've certainly learned something new today. Thank you to Yara for hosting this webinar, and especially to Eva, who's organised everything and helped us through our technical incompetence, well, my technical incompetence at any rate, it seems, with the webinar platform. And thank you very much to all of you for attending and for your questions. So once again, thank you to our speakers, to Yara, and to all of you for attending. You've been a wonderful, wonderful audience. So until next time, goodbye.